Hi, everyone. As you start reading your textbook for History 104, I'd like you to remember that as you go over all of the dates, facts, names, and details, so try to remember how this information fits into the basic theme of our course, which is the development, consolidation, and spread of Western civilization. So as you look at Chapter 1 of the textbook, remember that the overall theme of this is the birth of civilization. So let's discuss the meaning of civilization and culture in the context of the development of these early civilizations. About 5,000 years ago, our textbook tells us the Sumerians who lived near the Tigris and Euphrates River and the Egyptians who dwelled in the Nile Valley both pioneered civilization. Now, the basis of civilization, or the beginning of civilization, is what's known as culture. And culture is defined in your textbook as basically ways of living that are built up by a group and passed on from one generation to another. These practices can include things like courtship, child rearing practices, tools, clothing, shelters, ideas, institutions, and beliefs. And these are basically technologies that enable people to survive and to understand the world around them, to interact with each other. All civilizations, or all groups in this early period, are tribal groupings, bands, and tribes. So in the Paleolithic Age, that is the Old Stone Age, which lasted from about 1 million years ago to about 10,000 BC. Human beings were basically beginning to use tools. They were primarily hunters and gatherers. They made tools. They learned how to control fire. They acquired language and the ability to pass on what they learned to their children and others. They believed basically in religious faith and practice that is basically tied to magic and ways to manipulate or to understand the world around them. Most of these settlements were very sparsely settled. There was a division of labor by sex. Women cared for the homes and the villages. They gathered food, probably discovered how to plant seeds. And this leads us to the next period of time, the Neolithic Age, which is a period of time in which humans made the shift from being hunter-gatherers to practicing agriculture. They also started the process of domesticating animals, of storing surplus foods, and this in turn allowed them to settle down into more or less permanent settlement areas. Two of these in your textbook where people lived, they grew food, they stored them, they cooked them, they made cloth out of flax and wool. Two of these were in Turkey, and another, of course, is in the area of Jericho, where the people also engaged in trade, primarily in salt. This also caused increases in population in these areas, which leads us to another development in human civilization, which is the Bronze Age and the birth of civilization. Again, at the Tigris and Euphrates River and at the Nile River Valley, Nile River Delta in Egypt. In both of these places, we see the growth of towns along with villages, which larger populations, and we also see the creation of different kind of hierarchies, new technologies. They learned how to smelt iron, not iron yet, but bronze, and to manufacture that into tools and weapons, which are characteristic of urban life. They also traded commodities that they manufactured, like pottery and textiles. This also led to the development of social classes. Groups of people grouped into classes based on things like control of resources, family, religious or political authority, personal wealth, and the growth of cities. This led to the birth of civilization, and that's a stage in the evolution of organized society that is characterized by urbanism, or the growth of cities, long-distance trade, writing systems, and accelerated technological and social development. And interestingly enough, the writing systems developed in this era. Human beings passed from primarily oral culture, oral-based knowledge, to writing systems. Because of the complexity of civilization, they needed to keep written records of laws, of institutions, of trades. They wrote letters back and forth to each other, and of course, education, literacy is a sort of a technology that is primarily the preserve of wealthy people, and it also fed into the development of classes. So in your text on page 6 and 7, there is a discussion of Mesopotamia civilization, how that in northern Babylonia you see the development of the office of king, The large city of Kish, the Mesopotamians in northern Babylonia, had one of the first kings in history, and they also developed city-states, which were very large political entities. The Akkadians then, in turn, put together the first empire. They would conquer other peoples in the area around them and dominate them and demand tribute in forms of goods and services and soldiers and so forth. And these civilized records, these civilizations and these accumulation of records also lead in Babylon to the first law code in history, which is the Code of Hammurabi on page 10, which reveals a society divided by classes. There were nobles, commoners, and slaves. The laws did not treat these people equally. They were, in other words, recognized in society now legally by their social class. They had punishment, harsh punishment, based on the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. There were disputes over property and complaints of various sorts, which were heard by local assemblies of local citizens, leading citizens, heads of families, and for a fee, professional judges heard cases. There were written evidence and different kinds of witnesses called and entered in, and the verdict was written and it was issued. So this is clearly a very complex civilization. There were also different types of kings. In Assyria, the king served as a religious chief priest, whereas in Babylonia, the priesthood was separate from royalty. So here we see a confluence of religion and politics. These people, especially the Sumerians, invented writing systems, as far as we know, the cuneiform style of writing, which was on a clay tablet cut with a reed stylus or a pen, and we found quite a few of their records over the years. As far as religion goes, these people practice polytheism, which is the belief in many kinds of gods. And it's interesting, in polytheism, the gods are often local gods. There are certain gods that have certain functions in nature or certain dominion over certain aspects of life or certain areas and things like this. But under polytheism, the gods are primarily natural gods. They're located in nature and they often have human characteristics. In these societies, we see that monogamy was, to some extent, practiced. The role of women was very much circumscribed, and all of these societies, the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian, all depended upon slavery, both in the form of chattel slavery, permanent slavery, or people would be put into slavery because they couldn't pay their debts. So this is called debt slavery. There's also a discussion of Egypt there, and Egypt is a very certainly complex civilization based, again, around a river system, which means that these were settled societies and they practiced large-scale agriculture. On page 20 and 21 and pages following, there's a discussion of various kinds of dynasties in the area, the Hittite peoples, for example, the Assyrians, the Kassites in Babylonia. The important thing to remember is on page 22, the Hittites were the people who discovered the process of smelting iron, which is a lot harder kind of metal and, of course, a lot longer lasting, so it made better weapons and tools. And this leads us to a brand new era of time, the Iron Age, which is the period after 1100 BC or BCE, whichever you prefer. These people also, unfortunately, like humans tend to do, use these new technologies to carry out new kinds of warfare and to conquer each other. This in turn led to the rise of new kinds of civilizations, Neo-Babylonia under Nebuchadnezzar, and the Medes and the Persians, which conquered the area in the Middle East and put together the Persian Empire, which would turn out to be one of the longest lasting political entities in history. It actually lasted, it later became the Ottoman Empire and lasted all the way up into the 20th century to the end of the First World War. So all of these cultures together and all these complicated societies and all these changes all go together to create what we know as Western civilization. There's an important development on page 25, Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as he was called by the Greeks. He is one of the people who develops what's known as monotheism, which is a new kind of religion, a belief in one God who is all-powerful, who is the creator. It's interesting what Zarathustra does. He changes polytheism into monotheism by dividing the gods up into classes and calling one God the good God, and the rest of the gods now become demons who must be fought against. And this is one of the hallmarks of monotheism. So basically in Iran, where Zoroastrianism was developed, monotheism is created. And also, of course, on page 26, the Israelites in Palestine, they also perfect monotheism and have a belief in the Jewish God, who is not a natural force, does not have human characteristics, but who is all good, all powerful, and completely separate from nature. This new sort of religious systems, the perfection of the development and perfection of priesthoods and hierarchies, also leads to a new kind of authority, that laws now under monotheism come from God and therefore must be obeyed by humans, because God is the judge and the punisher as well as the creator and deity. On 29, all of these developments come together and are further refined in Greek thought, which is the basic foundation in a large part of a lot of Western culture and Western tradition. The Greeks really perfect and create quite a bit of what we think of in terms of Western, with all these other influences too that we've talked about. So Greek thought has two basic characteristics. On page 29, we see that the Greeks were first of all very rational and very skeptical. So they perfected rationalism and skepticism. Rationalism means that you try to understand the world without recourse to supernatural explanations. In other words, you can understand the world and its processes and its origins, and understand and investigate any kind of problem or situation based on a natural explanation. So a good example of that is Hippocrates, who was the father of medicine, and all doctors today, of course, still take the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocrates believed that you could understand, diagnose, and cure disease without believing that it had anything to do with natural forces. So in other words, let's give an example. Later, the Europeans in the 1300s and the Black Plague, the Black Death, many Europeans believed that the Black Death was happening because they were sinners and God was punishing them. Other Europeans believed that it was some kind of miasma from space that was making people sick, and other people believed that the Jews were poisoning the wells to kill Christians. But other Europeans, drawing upon this tradition of Greek skepticism, said, wait a minute, maybe it's not any of those things. And by the way, how can you say these things? You have to prove them, all right? So you have to prove it. So you have a hypothesis, and you try to prove that with evidence. That is skepticism. That is rationalism, both, really, in its essence. Thucydides, of course, believed, for example, that we could understand and explain and analyze human behavior in terms of science, in terms of human nature and chance, that left no place for the gods or for nature or anything like that. So human beings can understand the world around them, and we can understand things by having knowledge that we prove with evidence. That is rationalism, and that is basically skepticism. So that leads us to chapter 2, the rise of Greek civilization. And it's interesting that in Greek civilization, actually the roots of it come from Crete, which is a very small island, which you probably won't hear a lot about otherwise in history. The Minoans on Crete clearly show on page 34 that they have these influences from all around the world. Their architecture, for example, was influenced by Syria, by Asia Minor, and by Egypt, but they made it their own. They took these influences and made it a style and a quality that is unique to Crete. And that is, by the way, going to become, excuse me, one of the important allergy season. It's a bad time of year, excuse me. That is going to become one of the hallmarks of Western civilization, that it's very good at taking different kinds of influences, borrowing things from other cultures, and incorporating it into its own culture, refining it, perfecting it, and using the knowledge of other cultures to overcome them. So that one of the hallmarks of Western culture is borrowing from other cultures, and we'll see that again and again in this class. So the Minoans were very good at this. They had their own language. They had their own kind of hieroglyphics. They developed a basic Mycenaean culture, which you can read about on page 35 and 36. And when they started to decline, they did something very important, which is another hallmark of Western civilization. They migrated to other areas and took that culture with them and practiced it where they went. Now, why did people adopt Greek culture? Why did people adopt Western culture? Well, often it's because of military conquest, but it's also because of superior technology. There is, in a sense, in the world, a technological imperative. that you have to adopt technologies that work. If you don't, you're going to fall behind. Let's take the example of the Bronze Age versus the Iron Age. Iron weapons were harder, longer lasting, and more superior than bronze weapons. So if you had bronze weapons and fought someone with iron weapons, the odds were that you were going to lose the battle. And if you lost the battle, you could very well be destroyed. So you had to learn how to adapt this new technology and create iron weapons of your own so you could compete with those nations or those kingdoms that did have iron weapons. So that's the imperative. So another reason why Western technology, Western culture rather, is adapted is because it seems to work. It seems to be proven, and when it's put into practice, it is proven. So these Greeks went in different places, and they established their civilizations where they went, and local people would adapt them. Often they would, of course, intermarry. These Cretans, these Greeks would, whenever they went to other places. And of course, they were quite rude. The word Cretan means a very rude, backwards person, and it was applied to these early Cretes who spread Greek culture. So clearly they weren't the nicest people in the world. The poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, give us the only clear description of these early Greek societies, and the Homeric values of the hero, of manliness, of courage. These certainly become influential and becomes a part of culture. So the basic Greek form of the political form was a polis. When you look at Greek history, you'll see that a polis was a community of relatives, but it was even more than that. It was a group of citizens, all right, citizens who have a common stake in the political unit. They were descended from a common ancestor. They belonged to different subgroups, but they interacted with each other. They made laws, all right, based on justice. Aristotle, for example, the Greek philosopher, said that human beings are animals who live in a polis, who live in a political unit, all right? Humans alone have the power of speech, and from it we
derive the ability to distinguish good from bad, right from wrong. Now, sharing these things is what makes a household and a polis possible, makes it work. Without law and justice, Aristotle said, human beings were the worst animals and the most dangerous animals. They were nothing but destructors. They destroyed everything. They were the apex predator, right? But with justice and with laws, with these concepts, human beings could live better and live in communities without killing each other and wiping out their environment. They could exist, coexist, get along, rely on each other, okay? So, human beings can be at their best when they live in a political unit, a polis, that has justice. And justice is reinforced by laws. Now, justice doesn't come out of laws, okay? Laws come out of justice, the concept of justice, the concept of fairness, that you can't overstep your bounds, that you can't steal from other people. It's not right. The idea of rights comes out of this. We all have rights, all right? I don't have the right to come into your home and steal from you and rape your wife and take your children and take your property. I can't do that because I'm taking your rights away from you unfairly. So justice is the balance between human beings, individual human beings, and also between groups of people. So the polis was developed first at the Acropolis in Athens, for example, and in Athens we see the development of what we will later call democracy. So I want to finish up with chapter 2 in a part 2 of this video lecture, web lecture, virtual lecture, whatever we're calling it, series. I want to contrast Athenian democracy with Sparta, because these are two, if you like, prototypes of different kinds of societies. So in the next lecture, we will discuss Athenian democracy versus Spartan democracy and the different ways that they organize their societies. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.